Which healer is the hardest to play in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? Is there a ranking here, or are they all equally simple and it doesn't matter? Well, I ran some polls to gather some data, with results ranging from 7,000 to 10,000 votes, which definitely shows some interesting information. So what does the community of Final Fantasy XIV, or at least the ones we can poll here, think is the hardest healer job? For the longer version of the poll explanation, check the hardest tank video, link in the description. The way the polls are done is that we compare two jobs in pairs until every combination of jobs have been compared, and from this information we can get a ranking of what's considered harder than what. The question being polled is as simple as, what is the hardest job in your opinion? And welcome to the internet, we simply have to account for the fact that someone might vote based on casual content, hard content, leveling experience, max level experience, difficulty of optimization, or just for the lols. So let's talk about some of the things that can make a job easy or hard and get to the ranking of healers. Dead last, White Mage. In every poll White Mage featured in, it lost by a landslide, with the closest comparison being White Mage versus Sage, which is probably not surprising. What is quite interesting about White Mage when it comes to difficulty is that here and there it has weaknesses compared to the competition that indirectly can introduce extra difficulty due to what it lacks. That being said, the greatest weakness the player base recognized here was the lack of an extra party mitigation option, which was solved with the heavyweight raid tier when Plenary Indulgence got upgraded. The other most common weakness is that White Mage tends to compete with Astrologian for party slots, and a job with raid buffs tends to scale more wildly than one without, meaning White Mage has at times had trouble keeping up on the damage in top teams. Although, the majority of the player base either does not care about this or outright observes that this is typically not a relevant factor to consider. Which of course leads us to, what makes White Mage easy? White Mage's only attack cooldowns are Presence of Mind and Essize, which don't require too much planning to make work. On top of this, White Mage's main resource, Lilies, both simply provide healing and works as mobility options. And then there's Aflato's Misery. The majority of White Mage's toolkit, with a bit of exaggeration, boils down to I heal a lot, which is very easy to navigate, with very little that needs to be used before the damage happens, and reactive play is often easier than proactive since it means you won't have to worry about planning ahead nearly as much as other healers might. The pseudo-passive party healing provided by both Aflato's Rapture and Essize also means in more casual content that White Mage less frequently has to worry about as much target switching. I know that is an incredibly specific point of convenience, but it just underlines the magnitude of ease of use White Mage sometimes has at its disposal, and is a kind of less clearly observed convenience that can make players feel that White Mage is easier. Once it gets going, Holy also gives White Mage a much easier time dealing with AoE pulls. Finally, I'll also add that White Mage is generally just perceived as the intro healer, and the fact that it isn't known for some sort of particular complexity more heavily emphasizes the perception of the easy aspects of the healer. It is essentially a bit self-perpetuating, which is why White Mage is perceived to be a lot easier than the easier jobs in other roles. That being said, what makes White Mage hard? In an extremely weird twist, White Mage's initial leveling experience can be a lot rougher than the other healers, as White Mage plays catch-up when it comes to toolkit until at least around level 60. But this is rarely observed much, since players with the experience to recognize this tend to be experienced enough to either not care or play around this weakness. For instance, just not playing White Mage in low-level content. Another source of difficulty is that while White Mage has been helped along in this aspect with expansion over the years, White Mage is still a lot more GZD focused with its healing than its competitors, which can sometimes make it feel like you're being bottlenecked and that you would be able to do more if not for this. Another weird twist is that the fact White Mage is the only healer with a stun attached to its AoE attack means that playing around AoE pools is a bit different both for the white mage and the party if your healer happens to specifically be a white mage. The white mage has to consider when it is time to spam holy as the tank is pulling, and the tank might feel compelled to adjust their cooldowns based on the white mage's stuns, which can cause some unnecessary confusion. The precise timing of actions like SIs as well as the limitations of lilies can also box in a white mage to react in a very specific way to mechanics, at least when optimizing, which of course are factors that most players probably won't care about. And even if they did, these points of difficulty are not considered harder than what the other healers deal with. In sort of summary, the things that make white mage easy are extremely front and center things that are hard to ignore and come up in most content, while what makes white mage hard are rather specific things focused on optimization or problems that perhaps are not as difficult to overcome as they might sound. Third place, Sage. In a similar way to white mage being seen as the easier pure healer, Sage is often seen as the easier barrier healer. That doesn't change the fact that barrier healing is typically viewed as the harder of the two types, which in turn means that, of course, Sage was also considered harder than white mage by a huge majority. Despite this, any comparison that included Sage not against white mage led to a landslide vote to the other job, only slightly less dominant than the white mage polls, so there is definitely something to it. What makes Sage easy? Once we recognize that you probably are not going to use regular diagnosis and prognosis, the only spells in Sage's regular arsenal with a cast time are doses and Nevma, making Sage incredibly mobile. On top of that, assuming Adder Stings are being used and shields are not being used frivolously, Sage has some of the easiest MP management among the healers. The greatest mistake you can make is not using your resources, which is only rivaled by white mage's thin air. Placing Cardia on the tank and just leaving it there also removes a lot of the burden of keeping the tank healthy in casual content. Essentially, Sage's toolkit makes some of the most core objectives of a healer exceptionally easy once you get the hang of it. The sheer amount of different cooldowns available to Sage also means that it tends to have something for any situation, and compared to Scholar, has a bit more options for responding to a problem after it has already happened, making Sage more forgiving in that aspect. The quantity of cooldowns also enables Sage to handle most AoE pulls in dungeons following a set order and not really having to worry about what the tank is even doing in a lot of cases. A lot of these aspects of Sage translate vaguely to harder content, where Sage's incredible mobility makes mechanics easier to move for. It makes it easier for it to always have a barrier for every attack that asks for it. What makes Sage hard? We can call Sage easier Scholar as much as we want, but that doesn't change the fact that if you have no experience with Scholar or no healer experience whatsoever, Sage starting at level 70 can cause a major problem when trying to start the job. It isn't an uncommon story that players picking up Sage for the first time get dunked on by the tutorial quest for the job. A common weakness between the barrier healers is that they tend to deal a lot better with healing proactively than reactively, and their best options for handling reactive healing rely on resources that they have a limited supply of, a resource that is also tapped into for the proactive healing, meaning that a job like Sage can, at a lower skill level, easily go into a death spiral of needing to use their resources reactively, leading them to not have the resources for their superior proactive options, which then requires more resources to react to the expanding problem. That said, this is more of a what makes barrier healing hard than a Sage-specific problem. And indeed, proactive healing is by default more complex than reactive healing, as proactive requires you to know enough about the boss or encounters in general to be able to identify mechanics to deal with before they actually happen, while a reactive approach, of which pure healers do better, tends to be easier since you just have to find the most efficient way to make the HP bars go up again. One point of optimization that can be challenging with Sage is making the most of Cardia. Yes, you can just park it on a tank and call it a day, but if you want to avoid wasting it on overhealing, being able to move it around every second or third GCD really underlines how much you can do with it. All that being said, a large amount of what makes Sage difficult tends to boil down to difficulties of the role itself, and, at least in my opinion, is much less so about Sage's toolkit in particular, which probably also effectively explains why the second place is Scholar. Considering it is commonly recognized as harder, more convoluted Sage, this should come as no surprise, although for some, the fact Scholar isn't first place might be surprising. Staying on target, Scholar has a lot of challenges in common with Sage that are simply exacerbated by the fact that Scholar has to jump through more hoops to do the same thing at times, which of course leads us to what makes Scholar easy. Especially in more casual content, a large part of a Scholar's healing may stem entirely from the passive embrace heals from their pet, completely automated, to the degree that in lower level duties, a Scholar may not need to even think about healing at all. Scholar, also uniquely among the 4 healers, have access to an instant, infinitely spammable attack with respectable damage in Ruin 2, allowing it to sacrifice some damage for completely free mobility while continuing to attack. Expedient represents, I guess in a sort of weird way, an easier to make use of mobility cooldown, since you simply get an extra sprint for the whole party. And Excogitation allows you to preemptively heal someone, probably a tank, for when they need it. Most other aspects that might be easy for Scholar essentially represents things that are potentially even easier for Sage, meaning of course that we move on to what makes Scholar hard. Just to take it from the top, Scholars have to deal with what remains of pet jank in 14, which includes sometimes randomly delayed pet actions if you aren't actively placing it somewhere and mildly managing it. The fairy could randomly choose to distract themselves from healing the ones who really need it because someone took a hit that don't need attention right now. Scholar also has a weird core job feature that appears to be anti-synergy, in that it has multiple major defensive cooldowns that are each mutually exclusive in one way or another. And let's not forget the craziness of trying to calculate the defensive value of dissipation outside of particularly dire circumstances. And speaking of resource management, Aether Pact does allow the Scholar additional control over what the fairy is doing, but by simply choosing to use it, you have a more high maintenance version of Sage's Cardia to deal with. And when it comes to Ether Flow, thanks to the existence of Energy Drain, well, it is a minor detail in the grand scheme of optimization. Scholar's Ether Flow has a lot more to think about and plan around than Sage's Adderskull. Scholar, having Chain Stratagem, puts less emphasis on its own damage output to get the most out of it, but that also means Scholar has more reason to be more consistent with its cooldown usage so that it doesn't drift. In a way, Recitation sort of combines Sage's Zoe and Rizumata and sticks a stricter timer on it too. Where Sage can simply use each tool as needed, Scholar has to weigh what kind of action they want from Recitation, and it also tends to synergize with deployment tactics, which indeed introduces yet another core feature of Scholar, which, amazingly, despite that anti-synergy one I mentioned, is actual synergy, with Scholar often benefiting from stacking cooldowns onto each other for more value. Even something as simple as Sacred Soil is more complex than Sage's Keracholi, since, while the choice is often rather obvious, you do have to choose where you place the dome. Yet another solid example of the difficulty differences between these two is in Philosophia and Seraphism. Philosophia gets most of its value as long as you cast something, while Seraphism gets far less value if you just cast something and don't think too much about it. Finally, albeit a much less significant point of difficulty, thanks to Scholar's connection to Summoner, where Sage can appear in your roster at level 70, Scholar could step up at level 100, which could make it even harder to pick up if you haven't learned a structured way to deal with something like that. In summary, nearly every aspect of Scholar is a slightly more jank or slightly more difficult to manage version of what Sage has. That doesn't necessarily mean a worse version, but it does explain how Scholar would be considered harder. And then, of course, White Mage is considered the intro healer, so it makes sense it lands where it does too, from that alone. Leading us finally to the hardest healer, Astrologian. I'll admit, looking at the polls, I was thinking it could have gone either way. Are barriers and pet jank considered more difficult, or is it cards and weird cooldowns? Turns out it was the latter, and I can see it, although I do think there are also perceived difficulties involved in Astrologian. So let's get into it. What makes Astrologian easy? Thanks to the defensive cards the job has access to now, it almost doesn't matter what level we check, Astrologian always has an answer, and the answer is typically OGCD, so quick to fire. Options like Lightspeed also means that Astrologian can continue its rotation, whatever it is it wanted to do, somewhat unfazed by needing mobility on top. A large portion of Astrologian's damage potential coming from boosting others also puts less weight on the Astrologian's own capacity to find time to attack. Scholar is somewhat known to have the necessary tools to do anything you need, and Astrologian has a bit of a similar take, except Scholar emphasizes barriers a bit more and Astrologian emphasizes raw healing a bit more, and well, you can probably guess which one is more helpful to have on speed dial. But there is something to be said that having the capacity to do a bit of anything you need would make a job feel easier, since you have an answer every time. Now, what makes Astrologian hard? Let's just pick up the mic from a second ago. You have an answer for anything, but you have to figure out how to make that answer. Astrologian is filled to the brim with actions that don't do much on their own, buttons that rely on others to be more impactful, double-sided effects where you're supposed to figure out when it makes sense to use a button for just one thing, as well as several actions that requires a huge amount of planning ahead that goes beyond proactively responding to a mechanic as it is about to happen. No, you needed that earthly star down 10 seconds ago, buddy. Astrologian and Sage are sort of known to be the more button-spammy versions of each healer pair, so where White Mage can do something with one button at times, Astrologian often chooses to do it with 2 or 3, and while more button presses isn't that much difficulty on its own, it can be more overwhelming, especially when learning. And this gets even crazier once we talk burst windows. For White Mage and Sage, a 2-minute burst sort of mostly fills the GCD with stuff. They still have room in the OGCD to do whatever they want defensively. A damage optimizing Scholar has Chain Stratagem and Baneful Impaction to worry about, as well as however many energy drains they might use. This could fill out the every GCD, but Astrologian, while able to finish their OGCD arsenal for attacking much quicker than Scholar thanks to Lightspeed, adds on top party menuing to play and draw more cards in between all that, which can be challenging to learn to handle efficiently. A sort of funny contrast between White Mage and Astrologian mobility is that White Mage has Ethereal Shift, the Zoop, but also can just use a Lily every now and then if they need to adjust. They can sprinkle it out where they feel like it. Astrologian, on the other hand, has Lightspeed. Do you want 6 GCDs of movement? Or nothing, no in between, which in fights that ask for smaller movements can be really awkward to handle without losing uptime. Because Lightspeed is commonly used for burst windows, you also only really get one Lightspeed specifically for movement under optimal circumstances, so Astrologian can feel extremely immobile as a result. What is really important to note when comparing these healers is that where White Mage's ease of use is extremely front and center, with Astrologian, even the most basic of unique tool at their disposal can feel complicated to use, which puts its difficult handling front and center. It makes perfect sense it would be perceived as really hard. There is also the part that White Mage has had its Lily mechanic for 3 expansions, while Astrologian has had trouble keeping their card mechanic the same for more than 1 expansion. But with all that said, which healer do you find the hardest? There can be many reasons depending on what you focus on. For example, a Perfectionist player probably finds Scholar or Astrologian harder due to wanting to get maximum damage out of Energy Drain or knowing exactly who to card when and how. A player that is more focused on the leveling side of things might strangely find White Mage or Sage harder due to how one's toolkit sort of takes a bit to come online, while the other starts at maybe a bit too high level, making it feel overwhelming. It often really comes down to what you like to focus on. Personally, I do agree with the ranking order from the polls, although I am surprised just how much everyone agreed on a lot of the comparisons. I'd expected Sage and White Mage to be closer, and probably also Scholar and Sage to be a bit closer, but I do see it. A lot of players also play 14 on a controller, and while I am perfectly aware that the more experienced controller players say that healing on it is no issue, I hear a lot of less experienced controller players find especially Astrologian really hard to grasp, and that probably also plays a factor in these rankings. Please do let me know your opinions in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi, links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Astrologian's card mechanic has been changed impactfully in every single expansion since its addition. In Stormblood, the spear was changed from ability cooldown reduction, yes, I'm not kidding, to crit chance. In Shadowbringers, a whole thing with sacrificing cards to improve future cards was removed, and instead, card plays improved Divination's effect. Additionally, all cards now just increase damage output. In Endwalker, Divination was made a simple raid buff as it is now, and instead the card plays improved Astrodyne's ability to buff the Astrologian itself. And with Dawntrail, they removed Astrodyne and all of the RNG involved in the cards, and added back in defensive cards.